Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Thank you for joining us for our third lesson during our fall Bible study series. As always, we ask that you, if you're on Facebook, to share this video on Facebook. You can always go to our YouTube channel, SMZBC Worships, where generally the most people watch our Bible study series. Or you can go to a dial pad. If you have an app, you can just go to the app, dial pad, or you can just call 804-203-9011. I encourage others to do it, because if you can hear me, you already have done one of those three things. All right, let's get started. We're using Dr. Aubrey Hendricks' book, The Politics of Jesus, as our guide, as we've been talking about the first couple of weeks. Week 1, we dealt with treating the people's needs as holy, which, as you should be able to see, is the foundation of Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. Last week, we looked at strategy 2, which encouraged us to give a voice to the voiceless. Today, we move on to strategy 3, which will speak about, I will teach about exposing the workings of oppression. Our focal text is found in Matthew, the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 16. Let's listen.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?"
"Because no one has hired us."
He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his supervisor, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner.
"Oh, come on. These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour,"
they said.
"and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day?"
But he answered one of them, "Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So, the last will be first, and the first will be last."
In the traditional reading of this parable, the quote-unquote householder is God. The first workers called are Jews, and those chosen thereafter are Gentiles, and those who would become eventually Christians. In fact, most biblical commentators believe that with this parable, Jesus sought to teach that God's grace is equally available to all, regardless of when or how one enters into a relationship with God. From this perspective, the message that the parable appears to convey is that the benevolent God refuses to value those chosen first. And that, as I just said, the Jews over those who will come later. And in this sense, it can be understood to be a statement about the universality of God's grace. And that's how I've understood it until today, because Dr. Hendricks urges us to go deeper, dig deeper, look closer. He wants us to see that this parable is not simply a story of God's divine benevolence. It is also a tale of economic violence. It depicts an arbitrary and impulsive landowner who humiliates and exploits laborers desperate for work. Hendricks goes on to say that if we look even closer, we'll see that the landowner that is often thought to represent God is not kind and compassionate, but rather is arrogant, insulting, and take it a step further, dismissive. Worst of all, he's exploitive. Not only because the denarius a day he offers the workers is not a living wage, but because by even offering such an inadequate wage, he knowingly takes advantage of their desperation. So, when we read Matthew 20 of chapter verses 1 through 16 through a public theology lens, we will see that it is less about the benevolence of God's grace and more about a call to speak out against economic violence and economic exploitation. Let's take a deeper look. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind is that in the parable, Jesus speaks of dispossessed peasants, exploited and humiliated, desperately seeking work, and that those to whom he told the parable were poor peasants and dispossessed farmers, many of whom had themselves stood idle, exploited and humiliated, desperately hoping for work. It becomes clear that the details of the parable are not simply background, but in a very real way are crucial to its meaning. Verse 1 lets us know that the landowner went out early in the morning to hire day workers in his vineyard. Then verse 3 says a few hours later, about 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He hired them too. This happened multiple times during that day. This brings to mind how many day laborers stand outside of places like Lowe's on Lombardi or very popular places where people go to seek others, or they know persons are going to show up hoping that they will be picked up so that they can make some money for the day. Hendricks believes that the workers being in the marketplace is a sign of high unemployment. They were there ready to work, looking for someone to hire them. In desperation, the workers would have no choice but to accept the landowner's terms, and the landowner knew it. In the book, Dr. Hendricks shares his personal story of how Matthew 20 brought to mind images from his own childhood.
When I was 9 years old, my father, a self-employed brick mason, began taking me to work with him during my school vacations, not only in the summer, but in the spring and winter too. Our work days always began with a stop at a particular corner in a poor section of town. Although we never arrived later than 6:15 a.m., 50 or more men in dusty work clothes would already be there, greasy brown bag lunches in hand. My father would call out, as would the drivers of the other trucks easing up to the curb, and an eager worker or two would scramble into our open truck bed to huddle against the morning chill as we sped down the highway. My father usually told the workers the wage he was willing to pay before we drove off, though sometimes he forgot until we'd arrived at the work site, which might be an hour and a half away. Yet I don't remember any worker ever asking what he'd be paid at the day's end. Each apparently trusted, or at least hoped, to be treated fairly, but all seemed resigned to take whatever they could get. Apparently, they were relieved just to get a day's work. While reading the parable, I began to see the vacant, haunted eyes of those desperate men of my youth who wanted nothing more than a chance to earn enough for a day's groceries for their families. It became clear to me that this sense of desperation and resignation is what the workers in Jesus' parable must have also experienced. The difference is that my father never exploited or humiliated the few men who from time to time were in his employ. The same cannot be said of the householder in Jesus' parable.
The parable tells us that in addition to any house or houses the landowner might have possessed, he also owns vineyards so expansive that he must return repeatedly for laborers to work them. This describes a rather large estate rather than just some simple farm. And because the estate produces a large crop, it must be considered a plantation. Jesus begins the parable by explaining that what he is about to say is an analogy, saying, quote, "For the kingdom of heaven is like this," unquote. Notice, Jesus did not say, quote, "For God is like this," unquote, which is another reason for us to consider whether God is the landowner in the story. Jesus then goes on to detail the ways this rich plantation owner interacts with desperate workers milling around the marketplace. The owner sends the first round of workers into his vineyard after agreeing to pay them each a denarius for their day's work. However, this agreement is misleading. A denarius a day was apparently the going wage for manual labor in Israel at that time, but it was not a wage that would be considered a living wage. One denarius could barely feed one adult, much less an entire family. Any wage that is not a living wage is unjust, no matter what the reason, and to be forced to accept it is economic violence. Reasonable workers would never agree to work for a wage that could hardly sustain them and their loved ones, but they would accept it if left with no other choice. And getting ready for this lesson, we pulled some recent numbers to make sure we were all on the same page regarding how this is applicable to us in 2024. First, let's talk about the minimum wage. The minimum wage is the lowest amount of money that an employer can legally pay an employee. Now, in the United States, and this is amazing, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour. Let that sink in. The federal minimum wage. Now, states can determine their own minimum wage. And so in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we're somewhere in between the federal minimum wage and the highest minimum wage that a state or territory would have. In Virginia, what do you think the current minimum wage is? Do you even know what it is? Maybe some of you may know. I'll give you a second to guess. You probably go looking it up. So let me just say this. The current minimum wage is $12 an hour. Now, in January 2025, it'll raise 3.4% to $12.41 an hour. The District of Columbia has the highest minimum wage, which is $17 per hour. But when you dig into localities can set their own, particularly from a government perspective. I know in the city of Richmond, there is a certain wage. I think some jobs in the city of Richmond go up to $20. I know in Henrico County, where I help make those decisions, our minimum wage at the government is $15 an hour. We pay no one less than $15 an hour. And so it is the place where you are, they can set it. But I do want you to know that your United States government has its minimum wage as $7.25. All right. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, the current minimum wage is $12 an hour, like I said. And if someone worked full time, which is 2,080 hours per year, which is 40 hours a week times 52 weeks, they would earn $24,960. That equals $480 per week. Now ask yourself, who can comfortably live off of that? Now that leads to a discussion about living wage. And a living wage is defined as the minimum income necessary for a worker to meet their basic needs, such as food, clothing, and shelter. According to the MIT Living Wage Calculator, in 2024, a single person with no children would need to work full-time, which is 2,080 hours per year, and earn $21.85 per hour, or $45,442 in order to meet their basic needs. A two-parent household. And what do you think goes into that? All right. I know somebody saying $45,000 is a lot of money. Yeah. In this particular environment that we're in, where food costs have been up, gas is going down a little bit, but if you're renting or own and your rent fluctuates, or you have an adjustable rate mortgage, you feeling it right now. That was a single person with no children that I just said. Now, a two-parent household where both adults working full-time with 3 children, which was, that was my family a few years ago. All right, three children in the house at the same time. Each parent needs to earn at least $29.23 an hour, $30 an hour pretty much, or $121,593 for the year. All right. Now, the crazy thing is, again, I usually don't talk about my government job, but a part of the reason why we came up with a $60 million Making Housing More Affordable trust fund so that we can sow into communities that are being built and buy down the prices of homes so that people could afford mortgages was that we did some research and we found that to afford a mortgage for a house that was, I think, $275,000 or $300,000, which is like the starter price for homes that are being built, you needed $118,000 in the household. So that fits pretty much. And we just talking about living wage. We talking about bare minimum in essence. All right. And so we're not talking about minimum wage. Remember, we said minimum wage would get you about 24, about let's say 25, round it up, $25,000. Single person, no kids, living wage is about $45,000. And if you and someone else that you're in a relationship with have kids and y'all all live in the same house, $121,000 is what it's going to take to have a living wage. So you're saying, Rev, so you're talking about the difference between living wage and minimum wage. And so those who calculate living wages, some of the things that go into that: food, right? Child care, medical expenses, housing, all right? You gotta have a roof over your head, transportation costs, all right? If you out in the community doing stuff, the internet, all right? Mobile telephones. That's just to name a few of those things. Taxes, you gotta pay taxes, right? So all those things go into the living wage. So it goes without saying that there is a huge difference between the minimum wage and the living wage. The plantation owner knew the workers' desperation and chose to exploit it. Think about it. The workers would not have been in the marketplace had they had land of their own. They were so desperate that they would have accepted almost any wage. This was reflected in the response of the other workers hired throughout the day, who jumped at the plantation owner's offer without even asking what they'd be paid. They had no choice but to hope that he would honor his pledge to pay what is right, which he apparently considered his decision alone. After all, he was rich and they were not. And I know there might be some evangelical Christian who just wants to say, where's Tyrone Nelson over there teaching those folk at church? This is a very real struggle for folk. A lot of people just suspect that people want to do nothing. I don't know many people who want to do nothing. Most people want to work because they do want to have their own. They don't want to have to depend on somebody else to do something for them. And systemic racism and systemic posturing of governments have impacted the lives of many. When it comes time for the workers to be paid, their hopes are disappointed, for the plantation's owner's idea of what is quote unquote right differs from their own. Although the first group of workers has, quote, borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat, unquote, he insults their labor by paying them the same as others who have labored fewer hours, some far fewer. Some biblical commentators characterize the workers as resentful of their fellow toilers' good fortunes. But the workers do not protest his decision because their fellow workers, some of whom might be relatives, and all of whom are neighbors, are compensated for their labor. The text says that they grumbled, not against their neighbor, but against the plantation owner. In other words, they're angry with the plantation owner because he did not do what was right, although he had pledged that he would. If the actions of this plantation owner have not yet cast doubt upon the notion that he is a character representing God, what Jesus recounts next surely does. He tells us that rather than consider the validity of the workers' complaints, the plantation owner singles out their most vocal spokesperson. The first tip-off of the plantation owner's discontent is that he addresses the worker he has singled out as a word that is usually translated as friend. But actually, it's not a term of affection. Rather, it is a distancing term, like fella or buddy. And buddy is, I use buddy a lot, and doesn't always mean term of affection. It's the same term Jesus uses in Matthew 26:50 to greet Judas when Judas confronts him with Roman soldiers in tow. Fella, the plantation owner says predictably, I'm doing you no wrong, as if having the upper hand gives him the natural right to decide right and wrong. He then asks, didn't you agree with me to work for a denarius? Knowing full well that the desperate workers had no choice. If the plantation owner really wanted to do right at that moment, he would simply have paid his workers a living wage. The plantation owner uses the strategy that managers and bosses still use today with great success. He makes an example of the spokesman by getting rid of him. Take your things and get out of here, he says. He then tells the worker why he's firing him, because he, the boss, does as he pleases. Can I do what I choose with what is mine? Its arrogance and callousness do not reflect the merciful God that we know. Biblical scholar Warren Carter put it well, quote, we should not assume that the householder is God. Clues such as his large accumulation of land and subsequent inconsistent behavior and not addressing the inequities of his own wealth suggest that identification would be inappropriate, end quote. In fact, the plantation owner of Matthew 20 resembles nothing so much as one of today's arrogant, haughty corporate managers. The parable ends with a class reversal motif. Quote, so the last will be first and the first last, end quote. Jesus is likening the kingdom of God to a greater reality that will correct economic injustice and economic exploitation. It is true that Jesus' prediction that one class, the last, will take the place of another, the first, does not seem to reflect the rejection of class hierarchies that he exhibits elsewhere. But critiquing class hierarchies is not Jesus' focus here. His immediate point is that God's kingdom will free the beleaguered worker from their exploitation and their oppression. Jesus is telling all who are exploited and oppressed that although this is the way things are now, it will not be so in the kingdom of God. Jesus' reversal statement explained God's justice in a way that workers would have been able to hear and understand in the heat of their anger. And that would give hope to those who have given up on having a better life. And remember, the kingdom of God isn't just for up there. A part of our living is to create the kingdom of God here, right where we are. Jesus' hearers would have been angry by the parable's end. They would have recognized the down-to-earth reality of exploitative wages and the arrogant, insulting demeanor of the plantation owner and his sense of entitlement to do as he chose. After all, they experienced it every day. But although they lived it, it is likely that until that moment, many workers hadn't really understood all the dynamics of their plight. Because in their scuffle to survive, they had little opportunity to reflect upon the forces that tossed them to and fro. Lacking time, lacking perspective to contemplate their predicament, more often than not, they simply never identified the causes of economic violence that engulfed them. Most have simply accepted their lot as the order of things, as if their plight was natural and if their plight was God ordained. Jesus knew that the workers could never change their circumstances if they did not understand their own reality and the reasons for it. So he grasped their attention with a parable that highlighted the true injustice of their common situation. The ruling elite's notion that their wealth gave them the right to play God. He showed how the elite hid their role in the workers' pain and desperation by blaming them for their own plight. The rich feigned ignorance of the cause of the masses' poverty and suffering when they knew it was their own schemes and plots that robbed the people of their ancestral homes and their land. He brought it to light how the rich anointed their own evil as good and the workers' righteous discontent as evil. This strategy treats the people's needs as holy by seeking to raise their consciousness. That's what we're doing. Of the forces that hold them hostage to poverty and oppression and want. I hope y'all listening, because these are things that I want you to be paying attention to before you go cast a ballot. And even if you already cast a ballot, you need to be thinking about how you're going to be challenging some of this stuff with the people you either voted for or voted against. It is an important tactic for those of us today who also seek to treat the people's needs as holy by freeing them from their own economic shackles. We must be unrelenting in our efforts to lay bare for all to see the factors that today hold people hostage. Corporate cronyism, the unjust tax policies that benefits the haves and the have-mores beyond all others, the unjust social and economic barriers to upward mobility, the arrogance and duplicity of the modern-day corporate plantation owners and the politicians in cahoots with them, who define good and evil not by the tenets of the biblical faith that they profess to believe, but by whatever serves their own selfish interests. Like Jesus, we must help workers understand what is their fair share of the fruits of their labors. We must help them figure out how to get it. In this parable, Jesus explains in effect that in the kingdom of God, economic injustice will be eliminated. However, he was not suggesting that the victory will be accomplished by supernatural means. Jesus exposes the practice of those in control to isolate and punish spokespersons in order to intimidate workers and discourage them from actively opposing their mistreatment. Jesus demonstrates the need for workers to stand together in solidarity. Remember, in the parable, the workers do not blame each other for the injustice of their treatment. They blame the plantation owner. Jesus tells his hearers that despite the plantation owner's scheme, ultimately justice prevailed. Those the plantation owner exploited, the last and the lowest, became the first. And in this way, the parable imparts a very valuable lesson to laborers. If together they steadfastly stand for justice by confronting the plantation owners of their time with bold prophetic witness, ultimately they will experience the justice promised by the kingdom of God. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan made union busting acceptable by destroying the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization. Since then, workers who stand up for their rights have been routinely demonized, while corporate managers have been hailed as heroes. As a result, the number of unionized wage and salary workers in the United States dwindled from about 20% in 1983 to just 12.5% in 2004. 20 years later, the Bureau of Labor Statistics report, which came out in January, states that in 2023 the number had dropped to 10%. Now, part of the problem in our country, and I'll speak personally in a second, the most prosperous nation on the planet, is that workers seeking better living standards are now blamed for corporations' poor financial performances, while the right of corporate heads to live in luxury is seldom questioned, despite the fact that many corporate executives receive salaries hundreds of times greater than that of the average wage earner. Corporate CEOs and investment bankers have become heroes for fiscal conservatives in America, for increasing corporate profits, not by better management, but by destroying their workers' source of income, and even the pensions many work long and hard to earn. Too often, these multimillionaires and billionaires seem to live by the motto of Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street: greed is good. In the history of America, there have been many men and women, some known, some nameless, who have struggled to address the factors that undergird the oppression and the exploitation of the working class. At the end of his life, this was a major focus of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s ministry. Someone who also fought for the American worker is a lesser-known man, Walter Reuther. He was one of the few non-African Americans invited to speak at the March on Washington. He was an active advocate for civil rights, who worked closely with Dr. King and even organized the Citizens Committee for Equal Opportunity, which was an early advocate of affirmative action. He is among the foremost figures who have treated American workers' needs as holy. His road to labor leadership began in 1937 with a self-sacrificial act. He and some colleagues showed up at the gate of the Ford Motor Company's huge plant to distribute leaflets, calling the workers there to claim the full measure of their power and their rights with the slogan, "Unionism, not Fordism." They were nearly beaten to death by Ford's Service Department, which has been described as a private police force that employ mobsters and ex-cons to intimidate workers seeking to unionize. However, the beating seemed only to increase his passion for justice for American workers. In 1946, he was elected national president of the UAW with the pledge to work for a labor movement whose philosophy demands that it fight for the welfare of the public at large. Through his visionary leadership, he helped workers to understand not only that they deserve better wages and better working conditions than corporate America had ever allowed them, but also that they had the power to demand them. Under his leadership, the UAW won more concessions than most workers had dared to imagine. So many of the benefits that workers now take for granted are the result of his passionate leadership. Comprehensive health care programs, tuition refund programs, life insurance, profit sharing, severance pay, prepaid legal service plans, bereavement pay, jury duty pay, improvements in vacation, holidays, rest breaks, healthy and safe working environments, and sound grievance procedures all added immeasurably to the well-being, safety, dignity, and self-respect of American workers. In word and deed, Reuther was dedicated to treating the people's needs as holy. One of his favorite sayings was, "There is no greater calling than to serve your fellow men. There is no greater contribution than to help the weak. There is no greater satisfaction than to have it done well." In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, Jesus reflected his profound concern that workers and laborers be treated with fairness and justice. He also expressed his outrage at the economic violence with which the wealthy enrich themselves at the expense of those who bear the burden of the day and the scorching heat of labor, be that heat literal or figurative. He raised the people's consciousness of the forces that conspired to exploit them and brought to their attention the solidarity through which workers could change their condition. The parable of the workers in the vineyard is a profound expression of Jesus' care that the needs of all who labor should be treated as holy. That's one of the things that I have committed to do in my years of service in a place where I could actually impact it. And so I consistently challenge us to be a leader in pay, to make sure our health plans are the best, to make sure that we give people off on holidays, religious holidays that honor all religions, to make sure if there's some things that we can do to make people's work days better, their work life better, that we do it. And so I think that is something that we all should be looking at when it comes to these folk that we are voting for. Do they care about our well-being, and have they shown it? All right, that concludes today's Bible study. I hope you share this video and then come back again next week when we'll talk about the fourth political strategy that impacted Jesus' life and ministry. A few announcements before we go. Join our prayer call tomorrow morning, 804-203-9011 at 7 a.m. Children and Youth Choir will rehearse Saturday at 9:45, from 9:45 to 10:45, because we do have Holistic Hurt, Holistic Healing conference this weekend. Reminder, if you've not signed up, you need to sign up so that we can know how many persons will be here, so we can be the best host that we can be. All right, church school is back, and we'll be here Sunday at 9:30, and worship starts at 10:45. As we get ready for our Bible study chat, I want to hear your response to this question. In what ways can we apply the lessons from this parable to advocate for economic justice and fair treatment of workers in today's world? All right, it's time to head over to our After Bible Study chat. You can get there 3 different ways. Download the Dial Meetings app on your phone. Go to your browser. Number 2, go to your browser. Type in meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC. Or the easiest way is just to call 804-203-9011. All right, take care.